Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I head out for a walk and deliver an episode to you while I stroll around. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, greetings listeners. It's a cloudy morning here, June 20th. If I had to guess, I'd say we're going to get some rain today. The ground is dry right now, but it looks cloudy. It's actually, the weather has broken a bit too. It's been pretty hot the last few days, but today is pretty cool, so it makes for a very nice walk. Looking forward to talking to you today because I've got, I think a more interesting episode. Sometimes I dither a little bit about which pieces are interesting or not. I certainly wouldn't mind hearing from you which episodes are your favorite now that we've past 60 episodes. Do you have a couple that stick out as things you've really enjoyed? You could post those in the guild at 3269 on Board Game Geek, or you could just email me or send me a direct message on Board Game Geek. Those sorts of things help me as I'm thinking about which kinds of episodes to pursue and which ones can stay better on the floor. I'll do another episode later about my board game haul. Like I said, it was my birthday. I think I explained that already a little bit. But I'm sure I'll talk about those games a bit more soon. If nothing else, during the top of the stack check-in, I'll talk about what's new to the Shelf of Opportunity and what I've played in June. So I've mentioned a few times that my design partner and I, Rob and I, have a game company, Rattlebox Games. You've heard that name a whole bunch of times, and we are on our way toward our next Kickstarter. Right now we're sort of looking at the fall for that. And we've reached the point where we're going to do blind play testing, which is where we send a game to a tester and we send them the game and the instructions and a link to a rules video, but we don't actually teach them the game. They have to learn the game from the materials provided by the game and play it and then give us a report. Where possible, we're going to ask if people can set up a camera and record their play or do an audio recording of their play and send us that as well, because that'll really help us figure out where the sticking points are. But it's basically because our game is done. So this game is called In the Loop. It's a train game. You'll hear more from me about it in the coming months as I talk about different aspects of the design process. If you're somebody who's interested in this but not at all interested in design, you may find some episodes aren't necessary for skipping, but if you've been listening, I imagine you're going to find... I have trouble thinking those are going to be the uninteresting episodes. I guess it's a low self-esteem day for the podcast. I'm not sure why, but I'm glad you're listening if you've taken the time. What I wanted to talk about today was something that we're wrestling with this particular game, and I think it makes for an interesting thought experiment. I've heard in a variety of corners of the board game media sphere a commentary about the relationship of game size, the perception of the game, to the price people are willing to pay and the complexity people believe a game will have. Right, that when you're at a store, you see in the game box a number of things that shape how you feel the game is going to operate, what you feel the game is going to do. And one of the big things is box size and components. These shape your experience of the game. Now, I've talked quite a bit in the past about blinging out a game, about adding things to it, about making inserts and whatever, and that's not really what I'm talking about here, because those are things you do after you have the game and you know it. I've also talked about overproduced games, or a little bit of the idea of overproduced games a bit. Grimm Forest comes to mind, a beautifully produced game with an elaborate insert and really elaborate miniatures for the pieces, for a game that's ultimately pretty light. I think it's pretty interesting. It's got those friend cards and those ability cards. I can't remember what the game calls them, but and so it's got some depth to it, but ultimately you have these like elaborate minis that could easily be a token, and it wouldn't change the game experience at all. It would just change the table presence. I'm actually not talking about that so much as what I'm talking about is choosing game components not only for their playability, but for a more subtle kind of nuance having to do with expectation. And the place all this started for me, as I thought about what games are and what they should be, comes from early in our design days, and I apologize if I've shared this story before, but when Rob and I were first starting out our game company, we had a couple games we were working on, but both of the games that Rob and I started with, which are still in our production queue, were too elaborate for first games. That if we're going to start out, we wanted to do a kind of proof of concept game where we make a game together, produce it, do a Kickstarter for it, send it out to backers, that sort of thing. And so we were kind of casting around for a game that we could design together that was less complex, that was just going to be like cards and dice. And Rob was kicking around kind of spoonerism. So we had decided on the name Rattlebox Games. For a variety of reasons, Rattlebox sounds like a board game when you move it, right? That's what the sound is at the end of our podcasts. It's components shaking in a box. But the Rattlebox flower is also a flower of Northern Illinois. It's like the state flower or the regional flower or something. And so there's a kind of geographic or identity-based connection there, even if we don't have pictures of Rattlebox flowers anywhere in our material. We don't talk about the Rattlebox flower much, but that's kind of, it resonated for us as an interesting element. So Rob was kind of kicking around, writing stuff down and experimenting, and he wrote down the phrase Battle Rocks as a kind of, I guess, spoonerism of Rattlebox, and he got to thinking, what would a game called Battle Rocks be? And his idea was the germ of the game that we ultimately call Cromlech, about people using Stonehenge-type megaliths to generate magical energy and fight one another, having battle using rocks. And I liked that idea, and that's Cromlech is that game. But when we were pretty involved in a forum called the Board Game Design Lab, which has become a really robust place on Facebook in a way that, in my experience, it wasn't really on the website. I don't know if those forums on the website are still active or if they've moved it entirely to Facebook, but the Facebook endeavor is really working well, and they have a podcast now, and it's great. But at the time, I was posting a lot on the forums because I'd read that was a good place to find feedback, and when we had our sort of first spec and first complete rulebook, and we want to talk about what it was, I posted the spec rulebook on the website, and I said, here's this game we're working on, it's called Battle Rocks, and blah, 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 blah. And the very first response we got, which at the time felt a little, I don't want to say snarky, because that's not nice, but it felt unhelpful, was, I'm disappointed this game wasn't about giant rock monsters fighting one another. And it sort of felt like a little bit of a joke, like they were saying, kind of joking about this idea. But at the same time, that comment weighed on me, and it got me thinking about the way that a game's name or a game's physical presentation, like its box art, shapes how you perceive what it is from the get-go. And if that first impression is off, that can disconnect some people from investigating the game more. If you see a beautiful box cover and you think that's really neat, and then you go look at what the game is, the difference between your impression and what actually comes out could be that first germ of satisfaction that leads you away from being interested in the game. So that's part of what we've been thinking about with our current game that we're working on, which is called In the Loop. It's a train game. It's a game about building the Chicago elevated train system in the late 1800s, early 1900s, which was an incredibly corrupt sort of city politics kind of task. And so each player is a city official whose job it is to help determine where the elevated train goes, and you get kickbacks from businesses or from these engineering syndicates for giving them the contract to build segments of the train line. You also have a secret syndicate that you have allegiance with, and so the more that you can give them the business, the more money you'll get at the end. But of course, if someone else figures out which of the syndicates you're helping, then they can block you more effectively and have more money than you at the end. So it's an interesting game, and I'm really pleased with the way it's turned out. But after the experience of making Cromlech and the challenges of making custom dice and some of that stuff, we were trying to think about a game that we can make using just cards. And so in the Loop was designed to be played with just small square cards and small rectangular cards, what in the industry they might call mini cards or micro cards. They're the size, if you play Fantasy Flight games, they're the size of the small resource cards, like an Elder Sign. They're the small, like, weapons cards and that sort of thing. So the game was designed to be made using 3 sheets of cards, having a relatively conservative print profile, and thus be easy to produce and be able to hit that small box market. But as we played it, some of the reaction we would get was sort of like, this game is more complicated than it appears to be. And I think what's happening, I don't know that we've had this articulated very well by our playtesters yet, but it's hard because they don't get the chance to see the game and discover it without us there holding their hands, is the idea that this small box, and right now we're actually aiming for a very small box, sort of like if you've seen Saboteur or Uno, like a 2-deck Uno deck. It's maybe 5.5 wide by 3 inches tall. It's like the small box, card box size. This size of box is confusing to people. They don't assume that a game that comes in this kind of box will be a game that takes 45 to 90 minutes to play, that will have a rule book you have to read carefully, that sort of thing. That the size of the box influences what people think the game could be, and people tend to think a small box deserves, is going to be less strenuous. There's also the challenge that a small box also commands a smaller price, which, yeah, it's cheaper to make too, so that kind of weighs out in the balance. But a cheaper game is also generally seen as less robust in terms of thought processes. And one of the challenges about In the Loop is it is actually a fairly robust game from the learning perspective and the playing perspective. So, one of the things we're going to try during our blind playtest phase, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you how this goes, is trying out different formats with playtest groups. So we have a couple groups that we've been saving that are like blind playtest groups that will play the game, but we might be able to sit in the room with them while they're playing. We wouldn't say anything, but we'd be able to observe the play. That are like close friends or whatever, who still would be playing the game blind. So I actually bought some chipboard and printed the cards on a bigger scale, not much bigger though, and I actually made a tile version of the game where instead of cardstock, just cards, every piece of the game is made on tiles instead. And the game, it has to be in a bigger box to do that. It's at least a codename size box, but probably, honestly, it would have to be like the size of Century Spice Road, which makes it a $30 game instead of a $15 game. Or maybe even a $40 game. And here's the rub. Here's the part that's really interesting about that. One of our playtesters was talking about how he thought the game would be better as tiles, and I showed him the sort of prototype tile version. He's like, yeah, this would work a lot better. But then when we were talking about what he thought about the game, he said, yeah, I would play this as a $15 game. I don't think I'd pay $30 for this game. But he just said the game's correct size is this bigger size. So the challenge of the marketing of the board game, right, is to figure out what is the ideal size for the game, physical size. What is the ideal box art for the game? How do you get people to understand what the game is? based on the box art? Or do you go for something invigorating and exciting that'll get people to pick it up and look at it and then decide whether it's right for them, which is kind of the book cover model. And the way that I'd say most board games are going these days, they're hoping they'll be shelved, facing on the shelf, and if you see the game, or when you see the box cover on Board Game Geek or Amazon or whatever. So these are things that we're struggling with, but we've ordered our blind playtest copies. They should be in any day now, and we will be able to begin the process of determining whether or not the game works from a, if you get the game and you decide you want to play it, can you learn to play it perspective. So I guess I'm curious, of games you've played or bought, when have you had a game where the game's components mismatched your expectations for what the game was? This could be in art style, this could be in the shape or nature of the components, but when have you had a game where you played it, or you got it and played it, and it was just not what you expected it to be because the art, the nature, the physical nature of the game misled you in some way? I'm keen to hear your experiences with that. Real market research now, not just the usual fiddle-faddle of this podcast. So I hope that your June is going pleasantly, and I look forward to hearing from you about this and any other subject on Board Game Geek Guild 3269. You can also hit me up on Twitter at RattleboxGames, or by email, Brendan@RattleboxGames. Those avenues work as well. I think that's about it for me. Thanks for tuning in to listen to Pick Up and Deliver. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.